Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for this inaugural lecture by David Worthington. I'm Sarah Ann Munoz, and I'm a Professor of Rural Health at the University of the Highlands and Islands, and it's my great pleasure to be chairing the event today. And just before we kick off, I just wanted to remind everyone that the event is being recorded, and following the event, it will be uploaded to the YouTube channel of the university. So after David's presentation this afternoon, we will have some time to address some questions or points of discussion from the audience. So if you have anything that you would like to ask David, then you can pop that into the question and answer section by typing in your question, and we'll be able to put some of those to David after his presentation. But just before David starts, I'm going to ask our colleague, Dr. Brian Bogue, to introduce David as our speaker. Brian is UHI's Interim Dean of the Faculty of Arts, Humanities and Business, and has worked with David over the last decade. So no better person to introduce our speaker. Thanks very much, Brian.
Okay, thank you, Sarah, and welcome to everybody to this University of the Highlands and Islands inaugural professorial lecture. It's my great privilege to introduce Professor David Worthington on this occasion. David was born in Manchester, but he grew up from the age of 2 in Forres in Murray, and he regards Forres very much as his hometown. David studied social anthropology at the University of Edinburgh as an undergraduate before doing an M. Lit in historical studies and then a PhD in history at the University of Aberdeen, graduating in 2001. David went on after that to teach at the National University of Ireland, Maynooth. He taught at Aberdeen University on 3 separate occasions, and he taught at 2 universities in Poland. He then came to the UHI Centre for History in 2008. David went on to become the head of the centre, which is based in Dornoch, in 2011. Under his leadership, we have seen how a humanities-focused centre can grow in a gradual, sustainable and engaged manner, balancing success in the curriculum with success in research. We've seen a steady increase in undergraduate, postgraduate taught and postgraduate research student numbers and in staff numbers. The centre functions very much as a team. This has been a key factor in its success and will continue to be so with David at the helm. David has maintained particular research interest over the years and currently on a number of themes, particularly the Scottish migration to Central Europe, also coastal history. David plays a lead role in the International Coastal History Network. Today's lecture will provide a new perspective on what the Highlands was like in the century before Culloden. It will consider the pros and cons of using autobiographical sources for historical research. And it will ask what the subject of the lecture, the Reverend James Fraser, might tell us, for good or ill, about where the UHI region might be going or choose to go in the 21st century. It's been a huge privilege for me to work with Professor David Worthington for a number of years now, and to thank him for what he's done for the university and for the region. And I would like to invite David now to deliver his inaugural professorial lecture. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much, Sarah Ann and Brian. Okay. It was the summer of 1664. Sit back, relax, and cast your mind back to that year 357 years ago. Maybe even lull yourself into a false sense of security, as I claim that, by the standards of the time, it was a comparatively stable one in the north of Scotland. A minister and scholar called James Fraser in Kirkhill, a few miles west of Inverness, the man I'm going to focus on in my talk, tells us that he took inspiration that year from the knowledge that, I quote, historians sometimes entertain themselves with miraculous accidents, unquote. Fraser's writings covering 1664 are rich. They convey surprise, joy, wonder, a suggestion of equilibrium being restored after a convulsive period in the mid-century. His 30th year, a prolific period of writing, horse races to attend in Inverness, good times for someone of his political persuasion. But don't drift off. Any suggestion of a jubilant tone should not be overstated. A deeper engagement with Fraser's work shows how the booming and dissonance of the mid-century continued to resound and haunt the Firthside space where he would live out his years. Imagine yourself that year, alongside Fraser and below Inverness's Tomnahoorish Hill, daunted by the chiefs and retinue of Mackenzie and Lochiel, who'd gathered to settle a dispute, when Fraser states, "Earth, water, air rebounded at the sound of bagpipes' martial music." Wonder what it was like to endure that day of what Fraser called cruel thunder, when there was lightning 24 hours, and in our hills the height of Urquhart and Strathglass fell such pieces of ice, inch thick and 3-inch broad. Most devastating of all these snapshots of local life was what Fraser referred to as, quote, the signal instance and dreadful sight at 10 hours forenoon, one day when Inverness's populace witnessed the horror of their trusted wooden bridge over the Ness collapsing, with about 200 persons, men, women and children upon it, Fraser tells us. We also learn from Fraser's own writing that in his parish there were 39 deaths in 1664, including children. Note the passing of Isabel Fraser, quote, Culboke's daughter, died July 13th. James Fraser conveys his participation in these inspiring, enthralling, perplexing, terrifying or tragic local events of 1664 as an energetic and to all appearances popular young minister. By then he'd cultivated a world that was at once parochial, regional, national and transnational, links that helped him survive and even thrive amid such profound difficulties. Memories of the wider horizons provided by his university years and of the continental tour which had extricated him from the rule of Oliver Cromwell 7 years earlier must have been stirred when he bumped into Dr. William Forbes. He'd last seen him in Pisa in 1658. Assisted by such encounters by his network of fellow scholars and clerics in northern Scotland and beyond, via his copious notes, his enthusiastic reading of newsbooks, his vivid imagination, Fraser kept up with what was happening across Europe and the world. In France, where he said Louis XIV was increasing his sole government. In Sweden, where affairs were going quite wrong. In Poland, where the nobility or Schlachta were discontented, Fraser says. In Hungary, where the Ottoman Empire had lost the flower of their infantry. On the Iberian Peninsula, where the Spanish had made what Fraser called remarkable gains against the Portuguese. And across the Atlantic, where he noted the city once known as New Amsterdam being renamed New York as it transferred from Dutch to English control. The place from which this Gaelic-speaking son of the Highlands learnt of these events and viewed the world in 1664, and indeed throughout his life, was rooted in family, township and parish, but in no senses was it disconnected or unentangled. So whether you at this talk are interested in this region in the 17th or 21st century, my task tonight is to persuade you that he has some relevance. My talk will aim to provide a new perspective on the nature of the Highlands in the century preceding Culloden, drawing on autobiographical sources relating to this man from the shores of the Bewley Firth. Using a biographical method, I will follow 6 themes that track the trajectory of his life and which emphasize the scholarly and cultural contribution that he made from the region. A student, traveller, linguist, scientist, historian and minister. These 6 themes can be mapped to 3 phases of his life, 1634 to 57, 1657 to 60, and 1660 to 1709. Yep, the last phase is quite long. It's a half century and it's worthy of the 3 sections I've given it. 1688 to 90 is a major split within it, but we'll come to that. Chronology is a thorny issue in Highland history. Sometimes the entire period between 1493 and 1746 can appear enigmatic. An era of gradual decline, an age of forays, the Lyn na Crach in the 16th century that fades into, well, what exactly? Should we ask the Grand Seer? Certainly the 17th century is poorly known in memory. Rob Roy, Isabel Gowdy? Thanks to history writing, though, it is emerging more clearly due to scholars like Anus McKinnick, Doll William Stewart, Michael Newton, Hugh Cheap, Anne Fraser, Alan Kennedy, Alison Cathcart, Thomas Brochard, and Barry Robertson, to name a few. This is a vein of recent writing that is allowing for a more comprehensive, complex presentation of the Highland past in this period. My talk will, I trust, bring together some of these strands to highlight to listeners a different side, one which shows it as a time of Highland agency, engagement, resilience, and enmeshment in global events prior to the peripheralization, clearance, and depopulation that would come and which would characterize, in the simplest terms, the region's experience of the next 2 centuries and more. Now, I wish to engage with 2 key questions, and I'll come back to these at the end of the talk. The first, what are the pros and cons of relying on autobiographical sources for a study of the Highlands of the time? Well, they're really rich. There are 2 of 8 surviving sources left by Fraser, written by him, that I'm going to focus on. One is called the Wardlaw manuscript. It's held in the National Library of Scotland, and it's a history of the Frasers down to 1674. And the other is called the Triennial Travels, and it's Fraser's memoir of his travels in Europe. Another advantage is to give a new and different view. Fraser was an insider. He lived in the Highlands for nearly all of his life. The third reason is kind of a selfish one. This is a fascinating, colourful project. It's great fun. It positions my research in terms of what we're doing in the Centre for History and our recent Renaissance and Early Modern Research Alliance, REMRA, catchy acronym. So that's true, but what are the disadvantages? They're all in a Scots-influenced English, yet he's a Gaelic speaker. I'm going to come back to this. They're all deeply subjective and sometimes wholly inaccurate accounts. There is a danger of over-identification. I'm very aware of this in my relationship with James Fraser, such as it is. He's not a role model in many ways. There are many flaws to his character, and I'm going to talk about some of them. His is a place-specific, male, clerical account. It reflects the orthodoxy of the age until 1688 to 90, when his account actually becomes rather subversive. So I'll return to these 2 questions at the end of my talk. But the second one, just to say what I really want to make, the point I really want to make there is that Fraser was not a remote figure. I'm definitely going to challenge that. But in many ways, was he atypical in being so connected? Was he unique or different or particularly fortunate in that, in being an internationalist as well as a local minister? Okay, so now to the first of my 6 sections. The section at the top is a quote from James Fraser. Poppachey House lies less than 5 miles west of Inverness, alongside the A862 road as it snakes past the settlement of Bunghrew. In the mid to late 17th century, this spot by the Beauly Firth fizzed with intellectual activity. It was where James Fraser was born on New Year's Day 1634, a home which allowed him to move easily between his local parish in Kirkhill and his nearest borough of Inverness, where he attended the grammar school. Beyond that lay a broader environment of firths and low-lying peninsulas, the firthlands over which ferries zigzagged back and forth, not particularly comfortable ferries. There's also Aberdeen, where he went to university from 1651 to 5, and from there the rest of Scotland, also England and Europe, which all feature in Fraser's life. We need to position Fraser, geographically and intellectually, as an outward-looking scholar, part of a relatively vibrant North Highland intellectual culture centred around these firths. Poppachey, while no maritime complex, was a hub for this. The people of the Highlands and Islands have done more on the coast besides use it as a means to leave. Scotland's a country with over 10,000 miles of often indented littoral, much of it in the north and west, and these are often locations that evince identifiable histories. there has been an everyday, albeit contested, engagement with the shore, the links, the cliff, edge, the macher, and other spaces between sea and land. But in part, the coast has been the location for flames of activity as well as gloomy memories. I am an advocate for a coastal history that is distinct from a terrestrial or even maritime one, and consider that UHI has a vital part to play in this. Today, the vast majority of our university's academic partners are based within a mile or two of a sea loch, voe, bay, or in Fraser's case, firth. While Fraser's life was hardly maritime, the coast around Foppicky and the Firthlands was dynamic in his day and influenced him considerably as a scholar and student. Certainly he grew up at Foppicky with a sense of it being an intellectual part of not just the Fraser world, but the busy Firth-facing local life of families like the Usharts and the Mackenzies. Fraser contributed to the latest thinking on the crannogs that lay just offshore, what he called 3 great heaps of stones in the Bewley Firth. One of them of huge bigness, that's a great description, when revealed at low tide. Local tradition bearers also passed on to him the belief that there had once been a cell of scholarly hermits along the shore at Bunchrew. Elsewhere he informs his readers of the capture 1649 of so many herrings offshore that 40-50 boats and more were everyday fishing. Hard to imagine. 2 of his neighbours at Foppicky had migrated to the European continent. One had gone to the East Indies during his childhood. In 1670, he obtained there a copy of a work by an English historian, Camden, in exchange for putting up an English timber merchant whose boat had capsized. But it was not idyllic. Fraser's accounts of everyday Foppicky confirm also his witness of a 1640s murder on the shore, after which he recalled the guilty escaped across the Firth northwards at low tide. Evidently, his local coast was Fraser's major place, not just of witnessing violence, but of scholarly life, assisted by the books and manuscripts he obtained and read there. James Fraser would have been a model UHI student. Section 2. Fraser returned to Foppicky after university at King's College, Aberdeen, but according to his own reflections, he'd come to the conclusion by 1657 that Great Britain comprised, quote, an island divided from parts of the world. And as islanders, its people were, quote, lost and oft in need of foreign travels, unquote. He claimed that this was the impulse which that year, aged 23, prompted him to seek a testimonial and passport from the Inverness magistrates and the acting governor and secretary of the town's garrison, this being the period of Oliver's army, Oliver Cromwell that is, and their occupation of the borough. The pass was granted without any apparent obstacle and enabled the first move in a journey that would take Fraser, a European from its northwestern edge, to become a member of the papal bodyguard and in Rome to the Hungarian frontier with the Ottoman Empire and back to the centre of Europe as he described it in Prague. There are recurring features in the account. Regarding each location he visits, there is coverage of customs, the temper and hospitality of his fellow Frasers. Remember, they were an Anglo-Norman family, so there is an element of homecoming to Fraser's account of Normandy. Highlanders, Scots, English, Irish, and more rarely, local hosts. There was a strong diaspora in Europe, while Highland hospitality led to him having high expectations as well as generosity in this regard. We also find recollections of unusual encounters. Fire engines in London, an elephant in Vienna, chimney sweeps in Dieppe, descriptions of arts and architecture, food and drink, all pretty good apart from Dutch, recreation, sport, and extreme weather. Well, or more frequently, badly informed accounts of Catholics, Orthodox Christians, and Europe's Jewish and Islamic communities. His tone compares and contrasts with that in many ways more lofty and yet more limited one of the more aristocratic 18th century Italian-focused English-speaking traveller, usually associated with what was called the Grand Tour. But the North Sea led also to the Atlantic. The career of a near contemporary neighbour of Fraser's, Henry Mackintosh of Borland, allows us to see how Highlanders from the vicinity of Inverness were becoming entangled in the slave trade. This was, in Mackintosh's case, based on sugar and the importation of sugar, which had its origins in the Dutch colonies of South America. So Highland migrants were active simultaneous to James Fraser in the sugar-based enslavement of African and indigenous populations. Fraser had a connection with this. He claims possession of a 1644 letter from that Fraser relative I mentioned in the Dutch East Indies. Another way of highlighting this is through Fraser's diet. He notes drinking a Scots pint of claret wine and sugar for £1 sterling on departing Inverness in 1657, but also occasional products he obtained from visiting vessels, like in 1666, raisins, canary rice, oil, olive and spices, or the unexpected supply of mace, nutmeg, cinnamon, cloves and ginger, not all too easy to get right now in the supermarket in my experience, which he procured from the previously mentioned capsized English merchant's boat. James Fraser did not need to travel to become engaged in European scholarly life and entangled in global commerce. However, his 1657 to 60 journey through the continent had a major influence on this. Linguist. One of the most striking elements of James Fraser's European travels is as regards language, both his own and those of the people he saw around him. I have an admission to make. I'm a Gaelic learner only. This puts limits on what I can achieve in my work on James Fraser. I've been waiting for over a decade to do this work, and I'm determined to do it, and in many ways I can present a different picture. But James Fraser's interaction and his engagement with the Gaelic world is definitely something we need to focus on as a collective. One sees this through James Fraser meeting not Scottish Gaels on the continent, but Irish Gaels, as much as Scottish Gaels. So in Lyon, he's in a monastery at one point, and he talks about meeting with one Father Martin, an Irishman, a most discreet man, and finding that I could speak Irish, he doubled his kindness. There's another striking incident towards the end of his itinerary, near Brussels, where Fraser had his clothing, bags, and papers taken and checked by local officials. Struggling to understand their speech, and guessing at the Gaelic Irish identity of one man within the group, the temporarily trouserless Fraser decides to greet him in classical Gaelic, the version of the language still shared by scholars to some extent from both locations. The Irishman responded to Fraser in their common tongue. Astonishing, quote, all the rest to see him and me so intimate and speak a language which none of them could understand, unquote, by employing a phrase which Fraser translates as basically, I'll get your breeks back. But this goes to the heart of a current debate about how mutually intelligible the two forms of Gaelic remained. Fraser was an educated, curious, inquiring individual. In later life, he compiled his own Irish dictionary, we should read that as Scots Gaelic perhaps, and a book called Hibernologia, a volume of Irish verse, he says. This illuminates that his interest in Scots Gaelic went beyond the oral to the linguistic and literary, an interest that allowed for this level of communication with Gaelic Irish speakers on his travels. Numerous other examples show his confidence as regards Gaelic and how it informs his writings, those that survive in Scots-influenced English. We need more engagement with Gaelic scholars as regards James Fraser, without any doubt. But James Fraser and language is not just a question of Gaelic. In 1898, English scholar and critic Charles Whibley claimed Fraser's North Highland contemporary eccentric, Sir Thomas Urquhart of Cromarty, to have been, quote, the greatest translator of all time, unquote. It's not a view that's universally shared, but Whibley's statement gives fuel to the argument that to consider this part of the Highlands before Culloden as exclusively monolingual is false. In the Firthlands, at least, being trilingual was the norm in Fraser's lifetime. It was a region where Gaelic, Scots, and by the 1650s English all had their uses for everyday speech. It's almost certain that Fraser uttered his first words in Gaelic, this followed by him acquiring a speaking knowledge of Scots, reading knowledge of English, and in addition, Latin and some Hebrew. That's not bad. But his travel memoirs record his unusually fixed determination to attain verbal dexterity in French, Spanish, Italian, German, what he calls Slavonic, Hungarian, Bohemian, that's Czech, and Dutch. This is really unusual, in terms of his level of interest in languages and the kinds of languages he's interested in. It's not one that you find in most, certainly in the accounts of other travellers from the Stuart kingdoms as they were. Nevertheless, Fraser's surviving writings, while they're ripe for harvesting in terms of their references to languages, are in a Scots-influenced English, reflecting his wish to reach a wider audience. I think the two key points around language we can take from Fraser are his openness and fascination with the theme, and his clear expressions that he lived much of his adult life in a multilingual speaking, reading, and writing environment. The genesis of this came before 1657, but this period abroad strengthened his feelings and influenced him for the remainder of his life, when scholars from beyond Scotland would write to him for more detail on his native tongue. And I'm going to come back to this image actually later. One of those scholars who contacted Fraser in his later life was Edward Lloyd, Welsh scholar. Lloyd connected Fraser with a circle of intellectuals who wished to know much more. It wasn't just about language, though. There's a 1699 letter written by Fraser and published in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. And it's Fraser's account, ostensibly, of Loch Ness, but he talks about all sorts in there. He writes about, in terms of Loch Ness, about fathoming it, finding out how deep it was, talking about how Cromwellian soldiers were interested in that. He talks about weather conditions. He talks about geology. Now, this letter responded to Lloyd's request for his queries or conjectures on a wide range of curiosities, on etymology of Loch Ness, as we've heard, also on natural history, animals, flora and fauna, and archaeology, as well as allusions towards cosmology, meteorology, and geology. Fraser highlights the scholarly streams that could filter out from the north of Scotland, rather than it being simply a sponge soaking up metropolitan learning. While it could be deferential to centralising polities in both Edinburgh or London, he also shows from home, time and again, the vitality and connected nature of his intellectual contribution, obtained without ever living permanently anywhere other but the north of Scotland. Despite a lack of formal clubs, societies, libraries, or coffee houses to encourage him, Fraser positioned himself skillfully as the key Highland spokesperson and informant for these internationally known erudites. While he lacked proximity to a royal court or a princely household, Fraser became a cosmopolitan figure who made the most of his ministerial abilities, his local scholarly circles, regional affiliation, and skills of curation in order to engage in scholarship. He was not merely an instrument of Southern intellectuals. Instead, Fraser wished to impress on his friends and readers his own people's contribution to the pursuit of systematic knowledge of the physical world. In looking at a list he provides in the Wardlaw manuscript of 53 manuscripts in his own possession, one is struck by and left wondering by 3 of the lost pieces which exemplify what we might call the natural philosophical approach. A diary of weather contingencies, Nature's Treasure Tried, and another book on physic and surgery. One notes a preoccupation with weather and climate, with the natural world, and more idiosyncratically, a correlation of these with human health and medicine. Remarkable stuff. So see this quote about the telescope. Was this the application of a scientific approach to history, or just a trendy gadget? Fraser had excellent taste in his scholarship. His biggest intellectual passion of all was history and history books. This is witnessed in the Wardlaw manuscript, in which he writes the following. History being so germane and familiar to men of all estates, age, quality, sex, and condition, so agreeable to the inclination and suitable to the humour of all, so delightful in the perusal and profitable in the retention, affording content to the aged, pleasure to the young, and experience to both, comfort to the disconsolate, refreshment to the weary, and ease to discompassed minds, solacing the tedious hours of pensive watchings, or otherwise charming anxious thoughts into a sweet and gentle repose. It goes on, but his main statement after that, I think, is when he says, "It is indeed that telescope by which we see into distant ages." Although sometimes barely noticed, Fraser sits on a branch towards the top of the tree in terms of 17th century Highland and Scottish historians. While studying the past sometimes offered him respite, comfort, or escape from current woes, it could also provide vital examples of good and bad practice that were needed to inform present-day public life and policy. Skills in seeing things from different perspectives, getting out of his echo chamber. For Fraser, knowledge of history was not incontrovertible or immutable, but required careful archiving and regular representation and debate by scholars in order to take on its full meaning and purpose. Sir Robert Gordon and Sir Thomas Urquhart provide two other slightly earlier, more secular historians with whom Fraser was deeply familiar and who influenced his history writing, while Sir George Mackenzie of Rosehawk is a bigger shadow who looms large in Fraser's historical works. Mackenzie of Rosehawk, like Fraser, was really interested in what he called druids, those who didn't write their history down. However, like the others, Mackenzie was more metropolitan and less firmly rooted in the everyday Highland world than Fraser, and he also did not have the interest Fraser shows in oral history. Ultimately, James Fraser, a prime public historian of his day, is best viewed on his own terms. His secular boyhood passion for history, combined with a later evangelical, pastoral, at times intolerant wish to educate and make available historical accounts and books for as many as possible. This is vital towards understanding one key legacy of his, and this is the image I was going to show you before. His formative influence on the founding of the Highlands' first town library in Inverness in 1706. This is exemplified by at least one book of his. I'm not sure if you can read the dedication there, but one book of his which remains in the library to this day, a classical Gaelic Bible. All of this scholarship was not just about self-absorption. Fraser's learning informed his practice as a minister and was influenced also by his congregation. It's also in this role where we finally see some non-autobiographical sources for Fraser. Kirk session records, presbytery records tell us a bit about what others thought of him. All the assessments of his character, I have to say, are positive. For example, in May 1682, the Inverness Presbytery, a local church collection of 7 parishes, visited Kirkhill. All the elders and deacons gave James Fraser their ample testimony and approbation or approval as regards his conversation, his personal and pastoral skills, his doctrine, and his visitation of the sick. Given he lived through the religious convulsions associated with the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, the Restoration, the so-called glorious Revolution, and the Treaty of Union, it may seem surprising to highlight continuity as a feature of Fraser's life as a clergyman. Now, this continuity was not always a positive thing. Let's get real here. Fraser has troubling flaws as a role model, as I mentioned. One of the more enduring elements of the early modern Scottish Kirk that pre- and post-dated him was its part in the witch hunt. The persecution and sentencing to death of many hundred women across the country for supposed witchcraft. Several women died in appalling circumstances as a result of witch persecution in Kirkhill on Fraser's watch during his ministry. In a tragic case from 1662, he had a degree of culpability in this. That year, 14 women survived having their hair removed and a range of physical assaults from a so-called witch pricker in and around his church. Fraser doesn't mention having tried to intervene to stop it, and several of these women died in incarceration, either in the parish or one assumes in Inverness. That's one blot on his character. Another one is his anti-Semitic attitudes revealed on his travels. But if we rely solely on contemporary primary sources, any sense of pre- and post-1690 continuity, for good or ill, becomes faint. It seems almost certain that following the so-called Glorious Revolution, which I mentioned, he became wrapped up in a newly subversive early Jacobite community, supporters of the House of Stuart against William of Orange. That Jacobite community survived, albeit under great duress, and was a community perplexed at the turn of events that had led to them moving from being insiders to outsiders. Fraser, the educated and confident traveller, scholar, minister, lived on the margins in his final years. On his eventual death in 1709, no new episcopal minister would be appointed to Kirkhill, unlike on several neighbouring parishes. Eventually, the established church succeeded in appointing a Presbyterian incumbent as a replacement, but the appearance given is that it took many decades, perhaps more, before the relative stability conveyed in records for the Restoration period resumed. Indeed, the fate of Fraser's successor at Kirkhill was to have his manse attacked in 1743, tragically. Had Fraser experienced this? Apparently not. I would suggest those who would have been most justified in protesting to the curious cleric, as I call him, were probably the innocent witches of 1662, or those West Highland clans who he regularly scorned. So where does this leave us? James Fraser was a complex figure in dynamic times, and more of his autobiographical evidence survives in relation to some periods of his life than to others. Nevertheless, I hope a picture of his mental world, and of his character even, has emerged in some way through the 6 themes and 3 phases of his life I've outlined. First phase comprised his schooling, his first 23 years. Most of them lived out amid the violence, unrest and division of civil war. Education within that rapidly changing order. First under the man he called the Pope of Inverness Grammar School, probably a playful comment, and then at King's College, Aberdeen, followed by a brief, intense period and a return to the special energy, effectiveness, horror and absurdity, as he saw it, of the Cromwellian garrison town of Inverness. The second phase was defined by travel, comprising his time abroad, which I hope I've shown to be disproportionately influential on his personal development and on his linguistic abilities in particular. The third phase involved his return and settlement in Kirkhill. I began with his contribution to what we would call science. He didn't. His work as an historian and as a minister, and a hugely productive period of writing in strikingly settled times for him. The last 21 years of his life suggest a reappearance of some of the turbulence of these early years, although these years also show that in adversity, Fraser retained a level of dexterity. Most enigmatically of all, we need to consider the last source we have from him. It's his bill of mortality. What that does is list all that died, natives and strangers, in 48 years. So everybody that died in the parish of Kirkhill in the last 48 years of his life. Now, a copy of that is held in microfilm at the Highland Archive Centre in Inverness. And in my first visit to an archive since the start of the pandemic, I was looking at it recently, and it always moves me because the last entry in 1709 is his own. He marks his own impending death. It prompts me to return to my 2 main questions. Have I answered these? What are the pros and cons of relying on these autobiographical sources? Well, I think we should use them because they are uniquely rich, but handle them with caution. If we look at this plaque that I showed you before, it's interesting that it mentions Fraser as a theologian, a scholar, a linguist, a traveller, and a writer. It captures also his skills in Gaelic in the tribute at the bottom. But it doesn't mention him as an historian. Does he challenge this picture of the Highlands as remote? Again, I'll leave it to you to be the judge of that. Outlander may tell us quite a lot about what the Highlands was like before Culloden, but I hope I've provided a hint of a different kind of Highlands before 1746. A small piece in the jigsaw of current scholarship that's now emerging on this. Should I leave it to another time and another audience to ask if an individual's writings from 400 years ago tell us something of relevance about where we might be going and where we might seek to go in what is in 2021, once again, a vital, engaged and entangled Highlands and Islands? No, I'll take courage. What the heck? Go for it, David. We live in a region full of brilliant students and scholars, their curiosity matching Fraser and his contemporaries, and their diversity, tolerance and openness, thankfully, vastly exceeding his and that of his time. They may use iPhones, laptops and drones rather than the trendy telescopes of Fraser's time, but their focus is sharper. I've been inspired by looking back 15 years to my first boss at UHI, Jim Hunter's inaugural lecture, a wonderful piece of work, by the support I've had from my bosses, Karen Cullen, Brian Bogue, who helped introduce me, and the wonderful team I manage at the Centre for History. I think they would each agree with me that we need to give them, the budding historians, linguists, the creative writers, the musicians, the visual artists, the entrepreneurs, the botanists, medics, all sorts of scientists, the theologians and archaeologists of the UHI region, a chance to stay or arrive or leave or come back to challenge orthodoxies and flourish here and to influence the world beyond from here, to raise new generations and tackle the big issues of our day from their homes in the region. It's a prospect that many Highlanders in the 2 centuries or more that followed James Fraser must have found desperately hard to imagine. But there is, I can't help but feel, something oddly recognisable in the Highlands described by James Fraser, its problems as well as its advantages. In the 17th century and again today, we see a region that is 1, relatively populated, 2, up to speed and contributing distinctively to scholarly discourse, 3, intellectually confident and outward-looking, and 4, a place where scholars, those with curious minds, don't have to leave permanently in order to pursue successful careers and make their marks. That's something. As we look to see UHI play its part in brightening our region's prospects again now, history and figures like James Fraser may just offer us lessons, good and bad, on how we can do that, how we might see not just dead ends, but firth crossings not yet taken, alternative, even maverick pathways for a 21st century to take. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, for your presentation. Really excellent, really fascinating topics that you've raised there today. I think it really illustrates that the quality and the depth of the topics that are involved in your research, and yeah, really interesting to reflect on kind of those thoughts about the region in which our university operates and in which we're based as well. So I wonder, we've got a few minutes to take some questions. So if that's okay with you, David, we'll just put a couple of things to you just now. So you talked, yes, firstly you talked about those potential problems of using Fraser's autobiographical sources. I think around those positionality kind of questions of kind of his own positionality. So first question really is, are there other sources from the time that contrast with Fraser's views that you're familiar with? And if so, is there like anything you could tell us about those and maybe what some of those differences might be?
Do you mean other sources on him or on the Highlands in general?
On the Highlands, yeah.
Yeah, there are quite a variety of sources. I think his nearest equivalent is Martin Martin, who is a writer that's quite well known, who wrote a description of the Western Islands of Scotland. He actually spent more time outside the Highlands than Fraser, and was really, his whole career was dependent on being a writer much more than Fraser. Fraser was a minister. He did this for fun, I suppose. Sure, there are other perspectives on the Highlands. Absolutely. I'm not claiming this is the only element to Highland history at all. And I just think that he allows us to see, though, that the Highlands was part of Europe. It wasn't a vacuum. It was engaged, it was entangled, it was caught up in the rest of the world. But its character in so doing was slightly different from that of other parts of Scotland, maybe more than slightly different. And if we see that in the hands of somebody like Fraser, who's kind of a bridge between the Highlands and Lowlands in a way, then it seems likely that that was definitely the case in other parts of the Highlands. Other sources, yes. Gaelic sources are absolutely priceless for providing perspective on the Gaeltacht, of course. They're vital. But you have quite a lot of English language sources too, and Scots language sources in addition to that. I think the perspective from Edinburgh or London is much more negative. And I think that's what's really interesting to me, is to find sources that are not just written by Highlanders, but written by people who lived in the region. He knew what it was like to be in the Highlands. He wasn't writing as an expat or as somebody who once had lived there. He knew what it was like on the ground. So in that sense, I think we should recognise this as an important body of sources. But yeah, I think as I say, his approach to scholarship is in some ways reminiscent of other scholars, but I think it's unique. And I would say in his attitude to history, this focus on the need for looking at and assessing oral traditions, I find absolutely intriguing. And I think that's based on his role as a Shinachi, as a hereditary tradition bearer for the Lovat Frasers. So it's hard to generalize Seiran, I'm afraid, but I think he's certainly more positive about the Frasers. I mean, for goodness sake, he's exceptionally, he's almost bigoted actually, but he can be very critical of the Highlands too, and I think that's vitally important in a completely unjust way at times.
That's fascinating, thank you. I think maybe kind of related to that, another question is whether you can you say whether you think Fraser thought he was living in a remote place, or is that an impression or kind of an imposition that's come from elsewhere, or is there an understanding of whether he felt that he was remote?
I would say definitely not, and I don't think he was. Inverness was quite a busy port. It wasn't far away. It's a port that traded with the North Sea. He could go to most places from there eventually. I'm lucky enough. I've to have flown from Inverness to Amsterdam, and I always find it kind of interesting to not have to go to Edinburgh or to London in order to go abroad. It just fascinated me to be able to do that. And I think there is this sense of the sea as a highway. It's a bit of a cliche to say that, but I think he definitely didn't feel that. I don't think he even entered his mind. I mean, the Frasers remote, you must be joking. I don't think it would have even crossed his mind at any time to think that.
Fascinating. That, yeah, like you say, that role of the coast in kind of people's understanding of their position is really interesting, really fascinating. It's someone else has asked whether you see any kind of change in his views kind of before and after he made the journey that you were describing to it.
Well, that's interesting, but all of his views on the period before are his recollections and reminiscences. So he basically curates his childhood. It's not really necessarily an accurate presentation. It's a very interesting question, though. I think, yeah, I think it must have influenced him, but it looks like he completed his travel memoir before he completed his history of the Frasers. So we don't have any accounts of what he wrote when he was a child. We just have to trust him, or do we? Maybe we shouldn't trust him. But what I'm trying to do is just present his worldview and critique that, because I don't trust him. I think his travels, like I do in some ways, but I don't always. I've often wondered on his travels, was he just a spy? I mean, what did the Cromwellians actually pay him to go to the continent? And then I think, oh, that's ludicrous. But then it comes back to me. It keeps on haunting me, that one. So whatever he writes is always, there's politics in it, and it's deeply subjective. But I would tend to say that it didn't change him that much, because he already knew, what, 5 languages? So he had this openness. He'd grown up in an environment of hearing different languages, and I think that's what made him so fascinated with the Basque language, with Hungarian and Czech, for example. I think he knew what it was like to live in these bilingual and multilingual environments. I think he knew it more than we know today, more than I know it. I work in an English-speaking environment. I think it limits my worldview.
I'm just gonna have a quick look, David, and see if there's a couple of other points that have come through. So someone is asking, have the triennial travels been transcribed? And is there a full transcription of the Wardlow manuscript?
Great questions. I'll start with the Wardlaw manuscript because that's better known. There is an edited version of that. It was published in 1905 by the Scottish History Society, edited by William Mackay, who was a local scholar. It's a really good account in lots of ways. You can get it on archive.org if you want to look at it. But there's a revealing point in several sections that raised alarm bells for me, because the editor says, here follows a section by Fraser on contemporary Europe and politics. I'm leaving that out. Oh, he focuses on what Fraser writes about the family, the Frasers. He leaves out the bits about Europe. And that to me that's the flaw. I guess that's what people wanted to hear more in 1905. I think we live in a different age. To me, Fraser's Europeanness, if I could use that word, is really fascinating. And that's why there needs to be an updated version of that. So the Wardlaw manuscript is in the National Library of Scotland. I haven't been able to see it for a long time because it's kind of hard to get down from here in COVID times to see that manuscript. But I was using it a few years ago, and that's what it revealed to me. That European element definitely does exist. And in fact, its interests go beyond Europe. They're global. On the triennial travels, no, not yet. I would love that. I see that as the follow-up to this project for me. I'm writing a biography of Fraser, and there is a chapter, it's very similar to the structure I've used tonight, but I'm going to flag that up, and I will be seeking funding to read that project because it is priceless. It's an extraordinary account. Peter Davidson and Carol Morley described it as pretty much the most important travel memoir from Scotland in that period. And you could debate that. I mean, there's some other wonderful accounts, travel accounts from Scotland in that age. William Lithgow or Patrick Gordon. It doesn't really matter for tonight. But yeah, it's got to be done. It's a hugely revealing account, and it tells us a lot about language as well, in ways that I don't understand because I'm not a linguist of the Gaelic language, sadly.
Great, thank you. And one of the audience members is saying, wouldn't it be great if we could have this on Audible, which would increase the reach of these types of sources and making these publications more widely available. So just thought I would give you that suggestion.
I agree with that, Sarah. And sorry if you don't mind me saying, yeah, I at the Centre for History, we're really committed to public history and doing what we can to make things available. It's terrible when things are, when our research is not available to the wider world. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's super. Thank you. So I think we're kind of drawing to the end of the time that we have available for the questions. There are a couple of other ones, and we'll make sure that we pass those on to David as well, just because we've not been able to get through all of those today. I think just to finish up, maybe David, what do you think that James Fraser would have made of the formation of the University of the Highlands and Islands?
Oh dear. I think he would have been let's say quite a loud voice in it. Yeah, I think he would have made his opinions known. He might have struggled a bit to think of the region as a whole. It's fascinating to me to think of the Highlands and Islands and the way that has grown as an entity, and it's such a powerful force in our lives. But I wonder what that would have meant to him. He did have contacts with Orkney. He also had contacts with the Western Isles. So in fact, he knew people across the region. I think he would have loved it. And I think he would have been one of the stars of UHI, frankly. But he would also have probably been quite annoying at times. I don't know. It's maybe my subjectivity coming in. I try not to over-identify with this guy because, as I've said, there are many flaws to his character.
Thank you. So I think we're going to draw the event to a close just over the next few minutes. So I just wanted to thank you again, David. You've given us some really fascinating insights into the Highlands of the past, but you've done that in a way that's allowed us to reflect on our region and our university today as well. As I said before, it's really testament to the quality and the relevance of your own research, and really how that makes an important contribution to shaping the research landscapes in history, and particularly thinking about that. The pioneering work you've done around the coastal history, and those connections that you've highlighted between Highlands and Europe and beyond, really. So I guess similarly to Brian, I've known you for about 10 years or so as well, thinking on it. And during that time, we've both worked for the University of Highlands and Islands, and it's just so clear, David, that you're an incredibly well-respected academic and researcher, but you're also a really dedicated and effective educator and leader, and I know that it's greatly valued within the university. So, and I think that it's also very, very obvious that yourself and your team at the Centre for History are really highly respected and valued by your students, who time and again really let us know how enjoyable it is to study with the Centre for History. And your leadership of the centre, it's one in which you're clearly well respected and liked by your colleagues, and really the centre can act as an exemplar for other parts of our university. So the title of Professor that you're receiving, it represents the highest level of academic achievement that can be granted by any university in the UK. And it's reserved for an individual who's recognised as a leader in their field and has demonstrated excellence in their work. So there's no doubt that that's you, David, and I know that as a professor at the university, you're going to continue to be an outstanding ambassador for not just history, but for our Centre for History, your students, your colleagues, and for our university. So it really is a sincere pleasure to be the person that welcomes you, David, to the Professorial of UHI. So many, many congratulations indeed from myself.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and that's really moving, really touching. Lovely, thanks.
So that does bring us to the end of the event today, and it's just left for me to thank everyone for contributing. Just a reminder as well that the event was recorded, so that will be available within the next couple of weeks on the UHI YouTube channel. We've got lots of other UHI events scheduled, which you can have a look at on our website, uhi.ac.uk/events. The next inaugural lecture will be given by Alistair Keane, and that's on the subject of nanotechnology, including looking at examples of nanotechnology in nature, like butterfly wings and water harvesting beetles, as well as how nanotechnology can be applied to healthcare. And with that, I'm going to bring the event to a close, and thank you all very much again for joining us this afternoon.